This week I'm revisiting a shape that you may have seen me previously throw and trim, but I didn't show you what happens after that. So in this video I'll show you the entire process, from a lump of soft stoneware clay to the finished fired vessel. And of course, like any pot I throw, this process begins with the weighing out and wedging of the clay itself. Each one of these bowls will be thrown from 1 pound of clay, which is 453 grams. I tear each lump away from a much larger block of clay, which has already been thoroughly wedged by hand, so that it's as smooth as possible, and so there's no tiny pockets of air that might reside inside it. As each lump is made up of usually a few bits stuck together, once weighed out, I then spend a moment carefully wedging each one, amalgamating the clay, and just generally making a neater, rounder shape, which will be easier to throw with in the next stage. If I didn't do this, each lump would be quite scraggly and rough, and the likelihood that an air pocket might impede my throwing further down the line is much greater. Once all the clay has been wedged up, I can move it over to the wheel and begin the process of throwing the bowls. Each lump is slammed into the very centre of the wheel head, which I spin very quickly anti-clockwise, and then I cone it up and down a number of times, which helps to align the particles of the clay, and it makes the stoneware feel just a bit smoother beneath my hands. The aim here is to get it spinning as centrally as possible, which you can see reflected in my hands by how steady they are as they firmly clasp around the lump. I then plunge my fingers into the centre of the clay to form the apex of the base of the bowl. I then take the thick donut that surrounds it, and I pull it up, stretching and thinning it out as the walls grow more tall and wide. Throughout this entire process, the walls of the pot need to remain hydrated, otherwise the dry clay can stick to your hands, and the whole vessel might become slightly off-centered, or even twist and collapse. At this point, I want the rim of the bowl to be on the same level as my throwing gauge's pointer, which you can see jutting in from the right. And normally I tend to throw my bowls a bit taller than needs be, and then as I add the curve to the body, the rim will drop until it just about meets the point of my gauge perfectly. And by throwing each of the bowls to this same point in space, I can ensure that all the pots will be the same size. I also pay careful attention to the rim of the vessel itself, making sure that each one is thrown to a similar strength as the last. Once the pot has been thrown to the correct dimensions, I'll sponge out the excess water, and then I'll take a sharp metal kidney which has a curved edge, and I'll push it into the clay, transferring the curve from the tool to the soft clay. Then, on the outside, I'll scrape away a bit of excess, and I'll use a fine chamois leather to smooth over and compress the rim of the bowl. And as I felt the top of the curve was slightly too straight, I just threw this section to have a bit more of a curve in it. And that's the pot, finished. I then take a sharp, twisted metal wire and slide it underneath. I then dig my fingertips into the base portion which is left purposefully thick, and then I carefully lift the bowl away, placing it alongside its identical brothers, before beginning to throw the next. All of the bowls thrown will be set out like this to dry out slowly overnight. And to stop them from drying out too much, I built a makeshift damp cupboard over them. This essentially just creates a more stable atmosphere inside and protects the pots from any drafts, which could very easily dry them unevenly overnight. And there's nothing worse than coming in the following day only to find that all your pots are now far too dry and you can't even trim them. And these days I'd rather err on the side of caution. And as these spend a few hours drying to the point I can actually turn them in the morning, I'll throw another quick batch of pots, or I'll do some glazing, or I'll do some filming. And it tends to be that potters juggle a whole range of jobs at any one time, as there's so much waiting for the pots to be in the perfect condition so that they can be trimmed. And that's why you see me flip them over onto their rims, as it means the thicker bases, which usually stay damper for longer, can dry out. As ideally, before I trim these, I want the entire vessel to be more or less the same level of dryness. The next step for these bowls is to trim the bottoms. This lightens the form, and underneath each I create a tall foot ring, which holds the pot up elegantly. For a handful of these I wanted a slightly smoother interior surface, so I centered them and then just scraped them back a bit with the same metal kidney I used previously, just to make sure that the inside curve flows properly. I then flip the bowl over and tap center it into the middle. I then take 3 lumps of soft clay and carefully push them around the rim. I don't push them horizontally into the bowl itself, as doing so could cause the rim to deform. Instead, I push them down vertically, allowing the excess clay that splays outward be the clay that holds it in place. I then set my pair of calipers so they measure 5.5 centimeters across. This way, all the feet of the bowls I trim will be the same width. I then take a sharp potter's needle and together I score a circle. This marks the exterior boundary of my foot ring, and then the trimming can begin. For this process, I use very sharp tungsten carbide trimming tools. It's held incredibly firmly in my grasp, and I brace my hands together as I work to add stability to my movements. Once the wall portion has been trimmed, I'll then define the foot ring itself, breaking up the form into 2 distinct regions, the foot and the wall. As I turn, my left hand is really pushing down firmly from on top of the bowl, which helps to keep it pinned in place as I work, as there can be moments, say if the tool catches, that the bowl will want to leap up out of its restraints, so my left hand stays on top, guarding against that. I then turn 2 distinct facets into the foot portion itself and spend a quick moment correcting the angle where wall meets foot. The innermost groove will act as a glaze catch, as it creates an area into which the glaze can pool into as it flows down the curvaceous exterior surface. And once the exterior is done, it's time to hollow out the foot ring itself. This is a process I do bit by bit, hollowing out the well layer by layer, slowly tunneling inward. Ideally, I want the hollowed out portion to be at the same level as the walls outside of the foot ring, as another one of my goals throughout this entire process is to trim the piece so the cross section is the same all the way around, so there aren't any thick or thin spots. It's worth noting too that all the clay that's removed during this procedure can be quite easily recycled in studio and thrown into new pots, so virtually none of this clay is wasted. At the same time, I need to be careful not to trim too deep, as it's quite easy to trim a hole all the way through the bottom of the pot. With experience, I've become quite good at assessing the thickness left in the bottom, but I do still sometimes check, usually just by pressing down ever so slightly onto the base, and if I feel like there's any give, I know it's time to stop trimming downward. Once I'm content with the depth, I can begin to tidy up the facets, the very base of the pot itself, and stamp in my maker's mark, which is pushed in and rocked from side to side into still quite soft clay. And you'll see, as I do that, it displaces a bit of clay upward. So to remedy this, I trim the very bottom just to level the foot. And finally, I just burnish over the sharper edges with my fingertips, just so they're smoothed over slightly and not a sharp, crisp edge, as those will be more likely to chip with use. And that, for the time being, is the bowl finished. Next, I'll leave these out to slowly firm up until they're bone dry and all the moisture has left them. They change colour as this happens, lightening in both tone and weight, and it's only once they're completely bone dry can they be packed into my electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. This first round of firing changes the pot forever. Up until this point, they can be recycled endlessly, but once fired, the pots will harden dramatically as a permanent chemical change occurs, and the pots become both stronger and porous, which is necessary for when the pots are dipped in glaze, as the water, which is the vehicle of transport for the glaze, is absorbed into the clay body like a sponge, leaving a layer of the raw materials mixed into it on the surface of the pot, and it's that which becomes your glaze. For this first bisque firing though, the pots can touch, as it won't be getting hot enough for the clay to stick to itself, which means I can pack the pots in incredibly densely to make each firing as cost efficient as possible. These electric kilns are essentially giant toasters with a lid on. Slotted into the walls all the way around, you can see thick element wires, and it's these which progressively heat up during the firing, the lid trapping in all the hot air, as over a 9-hour period the kiln slowly goes from an ambient room temperature to 1000 degrees Celsius. At this point, if I were to tap a pot to hear it ring, it would simply break. Bone-dry pots, especially if trimmed really thinly, are incredibly fragile objects, so I pack the kiln with a lot of care and attention, as it's so easy to chip a rim or a foot ring as you're doing so. And once packed, the lid's closed and the firing can begin, which for this kiln is entirely automatic and happens overnight as I'm asleep. 2 days later, and the kiln is cool enough to unpack. The pots inside have changed colour slightly, turning a lighter shade of pink, and they even sound different to the touch. Sadly, the pink hue doesn't last. It's simply a side effect of all the red iron oxide this clay contains, and once finally glaze-fired in a reduction atmosphere, it becomes a sort of toasted grey-brown colour. And as you can see, this firing contained a variety of different bowls, all of which were thrown from 1 pound of clay. And if you're asking yourself why I keep using both imperial and metric measurements, it's because that's what potters in the UK tend to do, as a pound weight is a very functional one, which can be used to throw a variety of different shapes and forms. Sometimes it's easier just to use that, as opposed to being very exact and saying 453 grams. The next step for these bowls is for their feet to be waxed. I begin by mixing some pretty bog standard wax emulsion with some boiling water. The hot water thins it down and gets rid of any clumps there might be, which would otherwise just make the process of brushing it onto the clay more difficult. And as you might imagine, the wax acts as a wax resist and prevents part of the foot ring from absorbing any glaze, which is important as the bases of all of my pots are left bare, and you'll find that's the case with most handmade pottery. As if the bottom of the pot is glazed, it'll stick and fuse to the kiln shelf during the second firing, and removing it will usually not only damage the pot, but also the expensive kiln shelves they're fired upon. Waxing itself is a relatively fast procedure, especially in comparison to throwing and trimming the pots and glazing them. All I do is centre each one upside down on the wheel, in the same way they were positioned when I turned their foot rings. Then, I very carefully brush a layer of wax over the bowl's foot, and I'm very careful to make as neat a line as possible, as it means my glazing will appear more neatly later on. I'm also very careful not to accidentally splash any wax onto a portion of the pot I later want to glaze, as once the wax is on the clay, it can be quite difficult to remove properly. And then I dab a bit of extra wax over my maker's mark, just to make sure it's filled in properly. It only takes a day or so to wax a few hundred pots. The wax dries in moments, and I'd never dip them into the glaze when it's still wet. Just like throwing pots or trimming them, this process requires a really steady hand, but doing it neatly goes a long way in improving how accurately your glazes will be applied. I stack my bowls foot to foot like this, and whilst it may look very precarious, the wax quickly dries and holds the two pots together, which means I can manoeuvre the whole board out of the way, without worrying about them toppling over. Next, I grab each one with a pair of tongs. I hold it firmly, but not too tightly, as it is certainly possible to squeeze so hard that the pot shatters. I then submerge it for about 5 seconds, and then I remove it, allowing the excess glaze to drain out. And then I flip it the right way up, so the glaze pools into the bottom of the curve. The bowl is then set aside, and I'll leave these to dry for a couple of days before I tidy up their surfaces and the tongue marks. This white will turn a greyish colour once fired, and then if I add 1% red iron oxide to this glaze, it'll cause the end product, once reduction fired, will be a pale green tone. I have another glaze too that's 2% iron, and that will be an even deeper, darker green, and beyond that the greens begin to turn brown and then finally black as more red iron oxide is added to the original base glaze. After all the pots have been dipped, I'll leave them for a day or so to really dry out. This allows the surface of the glaze to become very powdery and fragile, as all the moisture evaporates from the pot, and although it is fragile, the surface is also much easier to tidy up, although this isn't always the case, and the technique I'm showing you in this video may very well not work for your own glazes, as each individual glaze recipe needs to be treated differently, as they can contain such a wide variety of raw materials. My focus at this point though is to clean over the tongue marks, which I do just by rubbing the surrounding area of the holes that are left, and the excess glaze that's removed as I rub my fingers over them is enough to fill up the holes. But perhaps most importantly at this stage, my aim is to tidy up the foot ring, which I'll mostly do with the use of a wet sponge, after I've evened out the surface and gone over any stray drips there might be. I work over a basin of water, which means the glaze dust falls straight into it, and ultimately it means I can recycle this glaze back into the larger buckets you saw earlier. So once again, very little is lost. I then use a wet sponge to fettle the foot ring, and my aim here is to make the line where clay and glaze meet as perfect and pristine as possible, as how the glaze is finished at this point really affects how neatly the pot will look once fired. Once the outside of the foot ring has been tidied up, I then carefully fettle the inside, and all of this is very slow, painstaking work, especially when you consider that I never have just one pot to finish. It's usually hundreds, and it can take a week or more to clean up 400 or 500 pots. It's a task I do whilst usually listening to audiobooks and podcasts, as that really helps pass the time, as otherwise it can become quite maddening and vastly repetitive. But at least it's one of the final steps, and next, now that I have several hundred pots ready for the kiln, I can begin to pack my Rohde KG-340 gas kiln, 340 being litres, which converts to roughly 12 cubic foot, which is the internal capacity of my kiln. That might not sound huge, but typically I can squeeze about 140 to 170 pots inside, and packing it is actually quite a quick process, though it can be a bit of a jigsaw, as this firing is quite different from the last, as no two pots can touch one another, otherwise the glazes on each will fuse together, and the only way to separate them will be to break them in half. The more dense the pack is, the easier it'll be to reduction fire, as there's simply less space for air, oxygen, to exist in, and reduction firing itself is a process where the kiln is placed into such a state where there's too little oxygen for the burning gas to ignite properly. This places the kiln into a reduced atmosphere, and it's this that creates a certain range of colours and textures, and these can be incredibly difficult to replicate in an electric kiln. And at this stage I'll pack some of those bowls you've seen me making. They're a bit more narrow and taller too, as compared to my usual medium bowls, but I think they'll make a welcome addition to my repertoire of pots, as they're slightly more functional for certain things. On the left hand side of the screen, you can see 3 coloured spikes. These are called pyrometric cones, and each one is formulated to melt and bend over under its own weight at a very specific temperature. I can look at them during the firing through spy holes in the kiln's door, and it's these which really act as indicators to let me know when the firing is concluded, as opposed to the pyrometer, which simply reads whether the temperature is going up or down. These cones measure heat work, which is heat over time, and that's what pots need. You can't just fire them to a peak temperature as quickly as possible, as the glaze and clay needs time to mature. Normally I place 2 cone packs in the kiln, one at the top and one at the bottom, and as I fire the kiln I try to do so in such a way that the 2 cone packs bend over evenly, which can be tricky to do as ultimately heat rises, and it's for that reason that I take the firing quite slow towards the end, just to give the internal chamber some time to hopefully even itself out. These top kiln shelves can be very difficult to place, as I need to try my best to not knock the shelf into any of the pots, as doing so can easily damage the glazed surface. And then, once the kiln is fully packed, and usually bright and early the following morning, I'll ignite and light each of the 4 burners, and then seal the door closed, and you really want to avoid closing the door first and then lighting the kiln, as that could lead to an explosion. When I'm firing, I open all the windows in my studio, which there are quite a few of, and there's also 2 skylights in the main studio itself. This helps to keep the room fully ventilated, and it means fresh oxygen can constantly be drawn in by the kiln as it fires. At the beginning, I let the temperature very slowly climb up, increasing the gas pressure just by a touch every half an hour or so. Additionally, every half hour, I note down the time, the hour, the temperature, the gas pressure, the air pressure, and what position the dampers are at, and then I log the current temperature on the graph above. And with all this information gathered over dozens of firings, it means I can quite easily replicate previous ones, if they were especially successful, for instance. But it isn't always down to the firing itself, and how you load the pots inside might make quite a big difference. During the very early stages of the firing, I have one burner that has the tendency to switch off, and so, for about an hour or so I place a mirror on the floor, just so I can easily glance down to see what the flame is doing. And then, at exactly 860 degrees Celsius, I initiate reduction. I do this by sliding the dampers halfway over the exit of the flue, and by increasing the gas pressure and air pressure quite dramatically. The partly covered flue throttles how quickly the exhaust can escape, and quite quickly the gas inside will start to burn inefficiently. And as the flames seek more oxygen to burn with, fire will start to jettison out of the spy holes and flues at the back. As there isn't enough oxygen inside the kiln, and to find it, oxygen molecules are pulled out of the clay and the glazes of the pots. And this is ultimately what provides the green tones you'll see at the end. If I were to fire these same pots with the same glazes in an electric kiln in an atmosphere which has plenty of oxygen, they will turn a noticeably different colour, like you can see with the white on this mug, which fires in a spot in the kiln which does oxidise very slightly, producing a yellow which isn't too appealing. The clay body fires very differently too, and you can quite clearly see the reduced area below and the oxidised area above. As the firing reaches its crescendo, I pay much more attention to it, checking the cones consistently and ceasing any other task I was doing, as throughout the day, as the kiln plods along, I can be doing other things, but every half hour on the dot, my attention comes back to the kiln and I assess what's going on, and I check the cones through the spy holes far more regularly, as I need to be very accurate regarding the time I end the firing, as if I underfire a little bit and the pots are too cool, they'll look dull and matte, and if I overfire the pots, I risk the glazes flowing off the vessels and ruining the kiln shelves. And as the temperature nears its peak of about 1290 degrees Celsius, I gradually tap the damper open, which causes the temperature to continue climbing when it gets stuck. And all of these drooped white objects are cones which have been through the kiln. They're now glassy and smooth, and the only reason they're coloured beforehand is so that you can more easily tell them apart. The pyrometer itself displays on this little digital readout, and the probe itself is inserted through the back of the kiln, about halfway up. Once the cones inside have all bent over sufficiently, I turn the mains off first, and then each of the 4 burners and the air. From this point, I'll crash cool the kiln down to 1000 degrees Celsius, which I do by opening the damper fully and removing the bungs from the spy holes in the door. This only takes about 30 minutes, and then I'll seal the kiln up properly, and a few days later, it's ready to unpack. I crack the door open, revealing pots that are now greens and blues and whites. They're as hard as stone, and are encased in glass. And from this point, it's just a matter of carefully unpacking all of the pieces and quickly polishing the base of each. The pots at the top are normally still far too hot to touch, so they're removed with gloves, otherwise they'd scald my skin. It's always a bit of an anxious moment when unloading the kiln, and there's usually a handful of really beautiful pots, and another handful which need to be smashed, as they're cracked or warped or defective. On a few pieces, some of the protective white coating on the kiln shelves will stick to the bottoms of the pots, and it isn't only this which needs to be ground away, but as the clay shrinks, which these do, about 12% from freshly thrown to glaze fired, the clay body itself will recede and reveal sharper specks of grog the clay contains, and it's these really which I'll polish clean, so they don't scrape your tabletop. It's a long process from beginning to end, and not including all the physical time spent actually making and glazing the pot. There are the dozens of hours when the pot is drying, heating up in the kilns, and finally cooling down. But it's all so worthwhile for this final moment when you handle the fruits of your labour, having turned what is essentially raw materials like clay, feldspar, talc, china clay, and red iron oxide into a finished, fired pot. To polish the foot rings of these bowls, I just soak some wet and dry sandpaper and carefully grind the pot in place for a moment or two. I don't want to sand them too much, as I quite like the contrast between smooth glaze and rough clay. Equally, if I polish away too firmly, I'll remove the nice flashed colour on the surface of the clay, which the reduction firing provides. And with that, the pot is finally properly finished. This green glaze is the pink-toned pots you saw earlier, and the slight brown-orange tone you can see on the rims of some of these pots is where the glaze itself has started to peel away from that sharp edge, revealing the high-content clay body beneath. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this video insightful, and if you have any more questions about the process or the pots, please let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you next week.